Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming at you Monday afternoon by the time this is up. I'll post it on YouTube again. This will probably be Monday evening for you all. I hope you all had a good weekend. I enjoyed reading your Crumb assignments in particular, and also your Justice assignments. I'm working through that, but especially your Crumb papers I thought were very interesting. By and large, pretty good. Pretty good. If you got anywhere from like 7 or above, consider that a pretty good job. If you got anything lower than that, then, or read the comments that I put there carefully, and or just email me more, and or just read the material more carefully, or do the work a little bit more carefully, and then I think you should improve vastly. But most of you did a pretty good job on that assignment. I would say if there was one common mistake among many of you, is that you were mistaking idealism as Plato means it with idealism as you think it should be meant relative within a materialist context. What I mean by that is many of you said Crumb is shallow because he focused on, a big butt or thick legs or a tall woman or that sort of thing. But real beauty is within, like it has something to do with moral character. Yes and no in the sense, but here I'm specifically asking you to assess whether you think Crumb's notion of physical female beauty, the idea of the perfect physical female specimen, right? So in this sense, there's nothing to do with inner beauty, right? That would be related to ideals of virtue and character and things like this, but that's really not the issue here. The issue here is I wanted you to assess whether his particular odd, offensive, disturbing, many of you said these were perverted views of female, the body, perfection, is more or less reasonable or objectionable or acceptable as mainstream notions of female beauty. So, and the difficulty with this assignment is that we don't quite know what Plato's idea would be. I think the closest to that would be what I think 2 students might have said. I think they wrote the paper together maybe, so it's really one paper. The closest thing that is probably accurate is what they mentioned, is that in Plato's time, the elite men were often in homosexual relationships with each other because women were less than human. And not only that, they look to young men, what we would call pedophilia, right? So if that is like the ideal physical form of beauty for that time, then it's very different from both Crumb and our mainstream notion, right? But for this assignment, I really wanted to get into the practice of you thinking through why so many, from what I read in your paper, so many of you were offended or put off by Crumb for whatever reasons. And many of you couldn't articulate exactly why. That's a problem, right? Because a lot of times we have strong views, strong convictions, but we can't really say why. Or we run into contradictions very carefully. For instance, a typical paper would say, I find Crumb objectionable. Why? Because he's so strange. Okay, well then that implies that popular opinion is what establishes normalcy. And by normalcy, what is good and proper? Well, you obviously see a problem with that, or many of you didn't, but some of you did, is that, well, if that's the case, then there really is no really good notion of beauty or justice or whatever. It's just whatever's popular. So we know clearly that popularity doesn't establish necessarily goodness or beauty or truth, right? So for me, that was the most pleasant part of the paper, to see how some of you struggled through that, working it through. Some of you saw the contradiction. Good for you. Others did not. It completely passed you by. That Crumb is bad because he's so strange and perverted. He's objectionable because he's so... he objectifies women so much, and women have a right to be as beautiful as they want. Each and every person, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, things like this. Yet you didn't mention a thing about how that critique might also apply to the mainstream notion of beauty, right? Why is it then that you privilege or you accept the normalcy of blonde, tall, long legs, big breasts. And crumb is so odd, right? So I hope you see that now a little bit for some of you. But by and large, you did a good job. Again, there's no necessarily right answer, but there are clearly some not as good answers, let's just say, right? So I hope that exercise was eye-opening at the very least, educational. Well, this is building up to, I always talk about the ideas and forms, and I must say that the way this class is structured, the class, the nature of the class is introduction to philosophy, but by way of history of philosophy. So, unfortunately, because we're going through it chronologically, right, we're throwing difficult stuff at you first because, this difficult stuff happened chronologically first. So idealism, Plato, these type of philosophers and concepts are very difficult, right? Some other classes, teach philosophy, introduce students to philosophy a different way, topical. So idealism might not be thrown at the beginning, right? Or some of Plato's easier works might have been eased in a little bit, and then we get to the Republic later on when we talk about, let's say, social or political philosophy. But not here. We have to throw them at you as it happened in history. So bear with us. I would say that for the vast majority of you, the class will get easier, right? The difficult stuff was at the beginning, right? This is not to say we're not going to cover difficult stuff later, but you'll get used to it, or these ideas build up on each other, right? So you have some sort of base as you keep going. Why? Because that's how it happened historically. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to talk about Aristotle today. Aristotle, many people say, is even a greater philosopher or more well-rounded philosopher than Plato. Why? Because Aristotle he does logic. He's the most important figure in the philosophical discipline of logic, at least classic thinker. He did science, or what would be science of his day, right? Inductive thinking, right? An empirical thinker is what he was. He obviously talked about political philosophy. He wrote a book called The Politics, which is a reply to the Republic, and ethics, of course, right? So ethics here, the excerpt you're reading, book 1 from his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics is one of the most important moral philosophy books you read. If you take any ethics course, you will have to read this, one way or another. Nicomachus is by legend his son. Some people say that Nicomachus is his father or father-in-law, but whomever it is someone he loves, and he's dedicating the book, right? The book itself is kind of a guideline of how to live the good life. You have to be mindful, of course, of the audience. It's for someone he personally loves, and also, because of that, it's someone who's also like Aristotle in the privileged class. This is important for us for several reasons, but 2, I'll say. 1, it opens up the critique that, it's another elitist life plan, another elitist worldview, another elitist system that is trying to justify and perpetuate itself. But also, it shows us how life was like back then. Democracy, although they had democracy, is not democracy as we know it. It's a democracy of equals, people within their classes. So they had slaves. They had women that they thought were literally less than fully human, meaning they're too emotional. They let their passions run amok, and their reason doesn't control their actions much. And so, male, property-owning, privileged, educated, these were the elite. And among them, there's a democracy, right? Friendship. Aristotle goes on and on about friendship in later works. And he means by this, treating everyone at your level the same. But there's no inter-level, between levels treatment of equality. That would be against nature. That would be nonsensical. Why would you treat someone below you on par with you? And why would you treat someone above you as if you were one of them. It makes no sense. And later on, religious systems, Thomas Aquinas, who takes upon Aristotle's work, many other religious systems just assume that this is true because what's natural is what's good, and God created nature, right? So in nature, there's a hierarchy, natural hierarchy. You look at, the pecking order of chickens. You look at, any gorilla, I don't know if you call it a clan or is it tribe, whatever, right? Or wolf pack. There's always an alpha establishing itself, right? And this is natural. So why would it be any different for human nature, human society, right? So it's a very reasonable perspective, right? We don't like it because our political system of rights and democracy is a very different worldview that we created. It's an artificial construct that we created because we envision a better way of life than that in nature. But keep that perspective, please. So Aristotle is the most brilliant, as far as we know, the most brilliant student of Plato. Plato is the most brilliant student of Socrates. Plato and Socrates are treated almost as one person, right? Because Plato wrote down everything that we know of Socrates, what he wrote or what he said. Both extremists philosophically. This world is a shadow world. We live in a cave. The real world is the world of ideas, which are eternal, the highest of which is the form of the good, which establishes kind of a foundation of valuation, right? How we even know about, how we even treat things as, let's say, beauty. How do we know that a certain object is more good than another with respect to beauty? Because we already have a fundamental notion of the good, the form of the good. Meaning we can't make aesthetic judgments, which one is more beautiful than another, or even the more fundamental question of why is something more beautiful more good? It seems such an obvious question to us. Why? Because we already have an understanding of the good. Well, okay, so that's their view. They're extreme once again, as you learned from last class. Politically, they're trying to create the perfect society. They don't give a damn if we could actually create such a society in this world, right? They like it, but no necessarily high hopes. And for them, the idea of the perfect society is more important than the actualization. So they can make recommendations like destroy the family, get rid of the institution of the family if you want equality. Never going to happen, right, in real life. So when we get to Aristotle, then Aristotle comes along, and Aristotle says that in his book, The Politics, I mentioned before, which is a reply to Republic, at the beginning of the Politics, he says, I have friends, but I also have my duty to truth. But with all due respect to my friends, I serve truth. I'm giving you a paraphrase, but that's essentially the opening line of his Politics. So he's already establishing that he will part ways with his friends, meaning the Platonic tradition. Now he's in agreement with a lot of it, but on major points he is clearly against it, right? He will part ways, so much so that Aristotle does not get picked as the leader of the Platonic school. The greatest university, if you will, of that time is Plato's Academy. He was no longer a Platonist because the Platonists, disciples carrying on the tradition of Platonic Socratic thought, essentially ostracized Aristotle. His views were too radical. Not too radical, meaning extreme. He was not extreme enough like the Platonists were. He was more moderate. And I hope you get this when you read Aristotle versus Socrates and Plato. Socrates and Plato throw these strong claims, one after another, right? Kind of like bombastic dialogues with Thrasymachus and people like this, right? And sometimes their claims are less reasonable than just charged with this perfect notion of the form of the good, right? It just kind of an assumed authority of the form of the good that cannot be challenged. Aristotle is quite different. He's much more reasonable, moderate. Reasonable doesn't necessarily mean right in this sense, as the Platonists would argue, but he's more moderate in tone. He says there's perfection, but then there's also reality. So notice that's a very distinct, different notion of realism, right? That there's perfection, but then there's probability. That's a better way of saying it. What's probably going to happen in this world is more important for us because we live in this world. He's not necessarily ruling out the ideas. Please don't misunderstand. He's in line with that tradition generally, but he emphasizes this world. Aristotle emphasizes this world because we live here. What could be more obvious, right? So with all due respect to Plato and Socrates, who are building these systems like, these ideas that may or may not ever happen, the Republic may or may not ever actualize, right? But Aristotle is focused on how the good life can be established here. And the way he goes about it is, for instance, Nicomachean ethics. The object is to produce a guideline, a blueprint of how to live the good life. So, first off, as a good empirical thinker, like a social scientist would, his strategy is very reasonable, like how we do social science. Instead of sitting in a room or walking around a garden with each other, and, devising systems in the sky, so to speak, right? These perfect systems of how we ought to live if we are perfectly rational, perfectly good. Aristotle looks at actual systems, actual societies that exist now or historically. So he compares. In political science, some of you are political science majors, you already took, as I did a long time ago, comparative politics, right? So you compare different political systems, right? Pros and cons and blah, 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 and all this. That's essentially what Aristotle does, right? So in the politics, if you're interested in that aspect, read the Politics, where he does it, extensively, and he critiques places like Sparta, right? But in Nicomachean ethics, he's kind of doing that same method, but about morality. So instead of coming up with these models of perfect virtue, right? He's looking at actual people in his society, and he, implies really that, he looks at society, and he sees people who are obviously more good than others. Now, at this point, you might question, well, how do you know if someone's obviously good or not? Well, to be fair to him, even in our society, you all are in, the East Coast there, right? Look in your campus. Look to your campus and observe people. Who are the better class? Now, for some of you, you will say, well, those people who drive Benzes, Lexus, Maseratis, I don't know. I don't know if students drive Maseratis, but maybe some faculty do. I have no idea. Not this faculty member. But anyway, wealth might be one, obvious thing, or maybe beauty. The prom queen, the football captain, the cheerleader type of women might be top of the list. Or for some of you, you know those people if you ever come across them, or maybe you yourself might be. Good for you. Old money, not new money, right? Old money. They're just a little bit different. I met one of these folks once, right? We could all clean up together, dress in nice, suits or tuxedos for a cocktail event or something like that. We could all be talking philosophy or academics or whatever, even current events or whatnot. But with old money, there's something different. There's something different. So, that's, just kind of our modern examples or whatnot. But back in his day, Aristotle looked in his society and he clearly saw people who were more virtuous, more morally good, had a better character than other people. And so he singles them out and he collects data, so to speak, and he extracts from these people, he reduces common qualities. What makes these people virtuous, right? What makes them stand out? So from this, they get the system of what we call virtue. So in the same set of virtues, though, he pretty much is in that line. He confirms the four cardinal virtues, or prime virtues, as they say, of Plato and Socrates. You have courage, you have temperance, which is moderation, you have wisdom, which is translated also as prudence, and then you have justice. These are the four main virtues. So Aristotle kind of confirms that in his observation as well. And so they, again, like I said, he's generally within that line of virtue. Their whole system is called virtue ethics as we know it now. They would be considered a virtue society, right? A virtue ethics society. Because the whole point of that society is to produce people, citizens of virtue. They have a clear focus and objective of what their society is for, right? And this is built upon Aristotle's notion of the telos, T-E-L-O-S. The telos for Aristotle is an end, a purpose, an aim, right? Not end of the movie, go home, but the end toward which we strive. So the telos of the human being is to reason. The function of the human being is to reason, and the reason is used for what? For the end, the telos of happiness. Happiness is the end of all things, and for human beings, happiness is also the end, but happiness achieved through our special faculty of reason. As far as he knows it, only the gods and humans have reason. It is the one divine element in humanity that separates us from animals. So in this sense, virtue ethics is also within the line of rationalism, that tradition and philosophy that emphasizes human reason as not necessarily the only constitution, only part of our constitution, but the most important, the essential part of human nature is reason. So, and again, here he, is in that tradition of Socrates and Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and this goes all the way down the line. And in modern times, the best representative of that is Kant, who we'll talk about. Other philosophers will emphasize sentiments, the feelings, right? Or religious people will emphasize the soul or the spirit as more important than reason or the body. But you get this idea, right? So, telos. All beings have an end. Nature provides an end for all beings. Aristotle has this interesting passage where he talks about an acorn. An acorn itself has an end. And what is that? To become a tree. I think an acorn becomes an oak tree, right? So the end, the telos for that acorn is to become a tree. But then he asks this question: what is the end of human beings? Well, happiness, right? To backtrack for that acorn, if you will, right? The happy acorn, if you could say that, the acorn that lives a fulfilled life of happiness, right, attaining that state of happiness, has developed into an oak tree. So then he asks a similar question: is there such an end for human beings? Well, yes, we too want to be happy like every other living being, but we are conscious, and through our reason, we can attain the highest happiness possible for human beings as thinking beings. So all virtues are conscious, reflective attempts to live the good life. But among even human beings, and this is toward the end of his Nicomachean Ethics, where he says the highest you're cynical, like Thrasymachus, by all you should know his view clearly. And if you don't, you're a bad reader or you haven't done the reading. So do the reading carefully. Plato, Republic. Thrasymachus might be right. Thrasymachus would look at Aristotle and say, oh my God, here's another person trying to game the system again, right? So, yes, so Thrasymachus might be correct, and he would think that he is with respect to Aristotle's the political system here. Okay, but if you read him charitably, Aristotle happens to be a person who's elite, but he takes the good of society so seriously that he is thinking very serious about how to not only lead himself, but as many people of his Athens, his political state, to the good life as possible. Okay, so from your reading, you have, book 1, read the Russell chapter on Aristotle. That's more of background information. I'm less concerned about you knowing all that stuff that Russell says because it's his take on Aristotle. Some of it's very keen observations, good stuff. But read that, of course, but especially read carefully book 1 of Aristotle and that link here that you have here, right? And so in the first line of book 1, he says, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that which all things aim. Telos, right? This is what he's talking about. So he establishes it from the beginning. Every art, every inquiry, every action and pursuit is aimed at the good. Right? Now you begin to, I hope, appreciate why the form of the good is just so important. Because reality is, if Aristotle says everything aims at the good, then we must obviously have some understanding of the good to begin with. Because if we have no idea of what the good is, the good life is, then how can we aim at it? Aristotle takes a more naturalist spin here because he includes not only human beings but irrational beings, so animals. Even I think he has a passage where he talks about like comets and things like that. That the comet pursues the good by orbiting. Or animals pursue the good in their animal-like ways. They're guided by not reason but instinct, right? But human beings aim at the good. Why? Through our reason. We know the form of the good clearly. So that's how he established it right here. Then, let's see. Book 2. If then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. Okay, so here he's establishing the highest good of all possible goods, because there's not only one good, right? There's perhaps countless goods in life. Aristotle is very reasonable. He's not like Socrates and Plato who are trying to have us like fixate, be obsessed with the form of the good and casting aside these shadows, these distractions of this world. Not like that. Aristotle enjoys the good things of life. He's a prototype of the privileged gentleman class, right? So he likes the comforts. And interestingly, in modern Britain, the other author you're reading, Bertrand Russell, right, in the other book, he is also a caricature almost, right? Fits perfectly the ideal of the British gentleman. And there's been much comparisons in the past where they compare the gentleman model of Aristotle, the classic Greeks, with the gentleman model of the English gentleman. Also, outside the West, even before Aristotle, was the Confucian gentleman, but the gentleman was more the academic. So think like, I don't know, tweed, elbow pads on the elbow pads on a tweed jacket, smoking a pipe. The gentleman / scholar would be Confucius. Well, this is, this is prevalent throughout history, right? This notion that there's some sort of higher elite class. The rational person is not this person who's, completely active physically, but reserved, moderate, right? Gentlemanly, right? He's not the firebrand as Socrates is, and certainly not like the guy who shoots off the cuff like Thrasymachus either, but he's the reserved gentleman. So Aristotle fits that. So does Bertrand Russell in his day, interestingly. Well, here he's asking if there's all these goods in life, and all these goods are good, but each of these goods, except one, are what we call instrumental goods. Meaning what? You pursue a good for another good. Health. I know some of you probably are very healthy. You eat right, you exercise, you sleep 8-10 hours. I don't know. There's a study that says you're sleeping hours a day. I mean, who the heck has that time for whatever, right? But however much sleep you get, you do all these things to be healthy, and you think health is an end for itself. Some of you might be kinesiology majors or something like that, exercise sciences. So you think health is a good in itself. No. What is health for? Health has a higher end. Wealth as well. No one works just to amass money, right? There must be another reason. Fame. No one pursues fame for its own sake. Well, Aristotle believes all of these lesser goods, they're all goods, right? He doesn't, excuse me, cord fell off here. He doesn't disrespect any of these lesser goods, but all these lesser goods are aimed toward one final good, highest good, the only good that is good in itself, self-contained, complete good. What is it? You guessed it, happiness. And the Greek word, the classic Greek word that we translate into happiness is eudaimonia. You have to know what this word is. Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia. English is limited, but our best translation is happiness. The problem with this is when we think about happiness, we think it kind of means pleasure, but Aristotle clearly has a distinction between happiness and pleasure. Happiness is fleeting. Not between person and person as well, right? Or happiness is fleeting because it's temporary, right? It's a feeling. So by happiness, he doesn't mean ha-ha. Also, happiness changes if it's pleasure. If your notion of happiness is pleasure, then pleasures can change, not between just one person to another. I like AC/DC, you might like Miley Cyrus, who knows, right? But within your own life, you change your pleasures, what's pleasurable to you. Think about it. 5 years ago, were the things that brought you pleasure 5 years ago the same things that bring pleasure to you now? For some of you, yeah, good for you. 10 years from now, it would be surprising if the things that you find pleasurable now, most pleasurable now, the same 10 years, 20 years from now. People change even within their lifetimes, right? So it's not stable. So happiness is not pleasure, because the life of pleasure can be achieved by animals, right? The animalistic way of life. And remember, there's a strong sense of elitism for these folks, because the last thing they want to be called is living the life of pleasure, which is animalistic, right? Humans have this elevated faculty of reason. So it's not that. So eudaimonia is a fulfillment, an actualization, using kind of a psychological word now, right? The levels of achievement or actualization, these theories that we get later on, right? They're really very similar to this, what Aristotle talks about here, right? So you get to see the genius when you read Aristotle closely. He anticipates a lot of this stuff later on. Or these other people kind of read off of Aristotle and copied a lot of that sort of stuff, obviously. Okay, so for Aristotle, and generally the classic Greek notion of the good, for human beings is the good life, the virtuous life. So, which is eudaimonia. It is a long and difficult life. It is not short. it is not easy to attain. It's a long and difficult life, he says, right? So that should be an important point to remember, because pleasures are easily attainable, more or less, but eudaimonia is difficult. Why? Because he implies strongly that there are certain proper pleasures to be pursued, and pleasures to be pursued in a certain way, to a certain extent, at a certain time, right? And what do you need for that? The virtue of wisdom. And certain pleasures should not be experienced too much, as he would say. And what kind of disciplines us from that? Temperance, or moderation, right? Which is another virtue. And sometimes you need to stick up for a certain good, or deny yourself a certain good, right? For virtue's sake, requires courage. And also, certain people in society should be given a certain amount of goods and things like that. A society should be ordered properly, and as well as your inner nature, your soul has to be ordered properly as well. Meaning your lesser elements, your passions, your desires, your natural inclinations should not rule over you and dominate your actions, but your reason should dominate and rule your soul. Justice. We learned from the previous section that justice is to give to each what each is due. That's a very conventional notion of justice, right? So then, giving to each what each is due for Aristotle means that in your soul, the highest part of your soul, reason, should be given its due as to ruling above the lower elements, which are passions. And in society, the corresponding levels are such that you could probably guess it. Those who are most naturally gifted with reason are the philosophers and the politicians, the political class. And they give to each what each is due, right? That's the virtue of justice. So a just society would have people naturally gifted for their particular functions in that society, given their due. So the ones equipped with reason by nature should be the ones who are ruling the society. Those who are more bestial in nature, meaning they pursue their passions, their desires, they should then practice virtue at their level of society, meaning the virtue that is most important for people who are naturally led most by their desires is what? Temperance, to moderate those desires. So at each level, right, within society and within your soul, there's a proper ordering, a balancing. So that is the just soul, and that is a just society. It's a brilliant system in its simplicity, if you think about it, right? The virtues allow the soul and the society to be properly ordered, to properly moderated, to be properly courageous when necessary. And if all these things are properly ordered thus, they are just, because justice is to give to each what is rightly due. Brilliant. Brilliant, right? So, these natural functions within your soul and your society lead to the most effective way to attain the highest good for human beings. This is not a system in which you should be good for the sake of being good. This is a very important distinction when we get to Kant in the future, who will criticize this left and right. But the whole point of virtue for Aristotle here is to lead to the highest output, so to speak. Justice pays in the end. How does justice pay? For the individual, the most just, the virtuous life leads to the happiest life. For the society, the life of virtue is the most virtuous society, the happiest society. So, if Aristotle were to encounter another way for a human being individually, the soul, to be happier than virtue system, or a society to be happier than the virtue system leads to, then he would entertain these alternatives seriously. But in his mind, There's no other system, no other mechanism by which you could reach a higher level of happiness. So this type of theory that is happiness directed, happiness oriented, right? That happiness is what drives the mechanics, the system. These type of systems we call eudaimonistic, after Aristotle's eudaimonia, right? So any system from henceforth that you'll study in this class that has for its main objective, its telos, happiness, are eudaimonistic in nature. Right? This is very different from other systems that we will encounter that are principle driven, that the output is not important, it's how we do it or the motive by which we do it. But this system is eudaimonistic because the whole intent is to get to the happiest life possible for the human being. Okay, so I hope you all understand, right? I'm kind of summarizing a bit here. Happiness is the only final end, complete end for human beings. Why? Because all other goods are directed toward happiness. You seek wealth to be happy. You seek health to be happy, and all of these sorts of things, right? Like you don't do things in them for themselves. And it makes sense for you to say, it doesn't make sense for you to say with happiness, unlike every other good, with happiness, it doesn't make sense to say, oh, I'm trying to be happy for X, for a higher end. It doesn't seem to make sense. And in this sense, Aristotle is very, very reasonable. So he is a tradition where the vast majority of philosophers and religions after him agree that it's just reasonable. It's a given that human beings want to be happy. And the question is then, how do you become happiest? Right? And this goes back to Socrates and Thrasymachus, right? Socrates is arguing to the end that it is better to be just than unjust. Thrasymachus is saying, no, the happier person is the unjust person. So really they're, arguing about the same thing that Aristotle is here, trying to develop a system for. How to be happiest. How to be happiest. But for Socrates, you have to be happy through virtue. There is no other way to be happy. Of course, the perceptive students here realize that this is a potential problem later to be exploited. Well then, how good are you if happiness is more important? Right? If you're using virtue as the most effective system to achieve the highest output of happiness, then is it really a good system in itself? This is a tricky question for Socrates and Plato and Aristotle because they have passages where they seem to be on both sides. But clearly, Aristotle here, at least in Book 1, establishes that that happiness is the final end. Right? And if happiness is the final natural end for all human beings, because we all desire to be happy, then the next obvious reasonable question is, well, then how do you attain happiness? Or what's the most effective way to attain happiness? Most effective way to attain happiness for the nature of rational beings is through virtue. Specific virtues here, right? Okay, so I hope that spurs a lot of kind of directed reading as you're reading through this, right? You get a hint of his elitism. It's inescapable in part 5 here in Book 1. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem to identify the good or happiness with pleasure. So this part 5 on Book 1, he talks about pleasure and happiness, right? And of course he's like kind of looking down at the vulgar type, right? Why? Because they're literally below him, right? If some of you know people, your friends, families, or maybe yourselves, right, that take pleasure, happiness for you is the pleasure of the vulgar type. Sex, getting drunk, getting high, whatever, right? Being popular, wealthy, famous. He's talking about you here, right? So the people who confuse the end of humanity with pleasures of the most vulgar type. These people are clearly mistaken, is what he's getting at, because he says there's a proper end, there's a something proper to a man, and not easily taken from him. He's talking about the good, our form of the good, our knowledge of the form of the good, which is divine, right? And then he says that the political life is a higher way of life than mere vulgar pleasure satisfaction. If you just live for pleasure and to be satisfied, right, you're not living among each other and for each other. This is what he means by the political life. For the Greeks, society, their word is polis, P-O-L-I-S, polis. It's usually translated as city-state, self-contained, right? So Aristotle, in the Politics, he says the human being is a political animal, meaning you can't be a human being if you're alone. If you're alone, solitary, isolated, right? So if you're just seeking your pleasures of the most vulgar type, you're really neglecting your own nature, is what he's saying, because the nature of human beings is political. And you could only be political and engage with other people, meaning you care about the common good. Because if you're only seeking your vulgar pleasures, guess who you're serving only? Yourself. But that's a far lesser type of happiness, right? These people are misled. You get the sense that he feels pity for these fools, right? Who only think that they're being happy by acquiring goods, money, fame, having sex, getting high, partying, and all of this stuff. He's not against these things. He's not a Puritan. Clearly not a Puritan. These are good, but if those are distracting you from the higher good of political engaged life, then they become bad, right? They become contrary to the good, right? The life of money-making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. Wow. In our society, we are then literally upside down from his society. That we are completely an unjust society because the people of wealth are the ones who are held in honor. They literally move and shake our political leaders, lobbyists. We have people like, to be running for president even, you have to have a lot of money. It's not virtue, it's money that comes first. Donald Trump, a reality television star, whether you love him or hate him, right? Donald Trump could only be a presidential candidate in our society or society like ours. Clearly not them. Because people back then would say, you're only good at making money. You're not necessarily virtuous, right? And you're so consumed by wealth that you think that it's a good in itself when it's really just an instrumental good for happiness. And not only that, but your notion of happiness is vulgar. It's misled. Okay. Book 6, he talks a little bit about the form, so then this should be reminiscent of Plato and Socrates here, right? Let's see. There's so much good stuff here, right? Point 7, or section 7, right, of book 1. He says that happiness must be a complete life. Again, this shows you how reasonable he is, right? Common sense, if you will. There are many people who, and he's responding to these types of people, there are many people who think that a short life of glory or virtue, like a super virtuous life, super courageous life, is better than a complete life. He might be thinking of people like Sparta who are rushing off into battle for glory. But then he says a truly virtuous life, eudaimonia, is achieved through a complete life. And here, he's being reasonable. If you have two people who claim to have lived the happy life, right? And one lives a full, let's say, 80 years and sees his kids, grandkids, maybe even great-grandchildren, and accomplished much, right? Maybe succeeded and failed through life, went through trials and tribulations, but was generally virtuous throughout a long life. and another person who is equally naturally good, like this person might be, maybe through disease or misfortune, bad health, lived up to 40 years of life. You can't possibly say that the one who lived so short is just as good or achieved just as much eudaimonia as the other. The good is a complete life. Why? Because the life of virtue is hard. It requires effort to calibrate your virtues every day, right? It's ongoing. So, this is one reason why the ancient Greeks would never have voted a person like Barack Obama, their political leader. Not because he's necessarily a bad person. He might be the most virtuous person or the most talented or the most devoted citizen. But he's too young would be their reply. You need to live more. You need to experience more, right? Because time tests the virtues of people. Time will test you, and the virtuous ones will stand the test of time, right? It's a very practical way of looking at it, right? So there's a lot of practicality in Aristotle that you don't see in Socrates and Plato, right? Which is why, to his fans, Aristotle seems just so much better and more reasonable and just more likable, more accessible, more understandable, right? You kind of I'm searching for that word, but you know what I'm saying, right? He's more recognizable as one of us, although he was an elitist and all that, right? But to his detractors, they're familiar with Plato and Socrates, the rigor, the extremism, right? The commitment to ideal beauty and truth and honor and goodness. And then you get to Aristotle, and he seems watered down. So there's that side too. He seems watered down. He's like compromising too much to the pleasures of this world, compromising too much to, what's possible, what's likely, not what's perfect, not what's perfectly good, right? So keep this in mind as you're reading this, right? Point 9, section 9, he talks about habituation. Very important. The way that we become virtuous is a constant life of habituation, starting at youth, moral education, moral formation, and a lifelong of habits throughout one's life. Okay, so I think I spoke long enough for today. I will just ask that you read carefully Book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics, and also, Russell for a good background here. And see me on Wednesday morning or Friday morning, whichever virtual class session you have. And secondly, email me questions that you have. Specific questions help. Only a few of you are emailing me, which suggests that either a lot of you are doing this very, very well on your own, and some of you clearly are. Keep doing what you're doing then, right? A lot of you apparently aren't showing up to the virtual classroom because you don't need it, because your work is very good. But some of you, I'm guessing, is because you just aren't doing the readings early on in the week. So you're probably rushing to submit these assignments on time before the deadlines. So you're not even emailing me questions. I hope that's not the case, right? So please email me questions, and I look forward to them, and I hope that you really enjoy and get a lot from Aristotle. All right, signing off. See you later.